In this tutorial, we will paint a close-up of the pink and purple fuchsia flower in 3 layers. It's a great example of how you can harness the power of watercolor layers to create a 3-dimensional form on paper, and you can apply this 3-step method to anything you love to paint. Faces, flowers, all sorts of objects. One interesting technique we will practice here is lifting paint, and it will come in handy for creating subtle highlights on our petals. As always, I will be using a variety of pigments to achieve rich color variations that I like for my painting style. But I encourage you to use your best judgment and a sense of style, so if you prefer a limited palette, I will outline that option as well. All materials are listed in the video description below, where you will also find a link to the reference photo. And if you're watching an extended 2-hour version of this tutorial on my Patreon, then you can also download the black and white outlines of the flower. I made 2 versions for your convenience, one with and one without the shadows. Now, if you're ready, let's get started with the first layer. Our technique is wet on wet, meaning we will cover one petal at a time with some very light color and add additional colors while the paper surface is still wet. 2 things to keep in mind. We're painting one petal at a time, starting up on top with red, and we are keeping it super light. Forget about the shadows for now, we will paint them in the next layer. The only thing we need to focus on right now is creating a very light color map with subtle variations in hue and value. I'm starting on the left-hand side because it's always easier for me to work left to right, top down, to avoid smudges. I'm wearing my glove to further protect my paper, and I'm starting with my cooler red. Notice again, super light, almost pure water, just a little bit of red so I can see the surface area that I'm working with. I'm looking at my reference photo and I'm simply marking up the main areas of color. So at this point, my mixture of paint is very light. You can see it on the palette on the right hand side. My paper is drying out, but it's still quite wet, so we have an opportunity to add a little bit more definition. So I'm going to be dropping more and more saturated coral in those areas that we see as shadows in the reference photo. By the way, if you like this tutorial, the best way to support my channel is to like the video and subscribe. Of course, you can share it with your friends who love to paint. This really helps my channel when you spread the word, and I really appreciate it. Now let's get back to our flower. Here I'm going to start with a very light mixture of coral, again just to mark up the main area I'm going to be working on. As I move towards the tip, feels like, based on the reference photo, that it's kind of cooler there, and I'm going to switch to quinacridone red. Here I'm going to also try to leave a few spots dry just for highlights. Now let's drop a little bit of deeper color, wet into wet. I'm going to focus on what I see as darker shadow areas. So a little bit around the base, in the center, around the edges. This is how wet my paper is at this point, and we may have maybe another minute maximum to add a little bit of color, which I'm gonna do just at the base where it meets the green bud. Lots of shadows there, and we will add lots more in the next layer. Let's move to the bottom now and work on the purple petals. And here I want some very good variation in value, meaning lights and darks. So I'm going to outline the area in the center that I'm working on. I'm going to outline it with a mixture of purple and magenta, or you can use pure quinacridone violet. So just a warmer shade of purple essentially. And when I'm done, I'm going to connect those strokes with pure water, maybe even a little bit of pink. So basically the center should be quite light, almost pure white. I'm gonna add a little bit of pure purple, and let's not forget about the top part. A little bit of purple there too while it's still wet. Here I'm not afraid to go very saturated purple, then magenta, and then coral around that highlight. Next, let's work on the smaller petal that's in the center, and this one has a combination of different shades from purple all the way to pink. The one thing that is important is to leave a very small thin edge around the edge of the petal. Leave it dry. The petal has quite a bit of volume, it's thick, and that highlight will help us create a sense of a three-dimensional shape. Up on top, a little bit of coral or your warmer red. I'm very slowly building the color, see how it spreads, not going with fully saturated pigment right away. I want to be very careful so that the center of the petal remains very light. And now we can do a few veins. I'm gonna grab some coral, maybe magenta, and paint those lines wet into wet so the veins will be visible but very soft. And the last thing I'm gonna do is use damp brush, tap it on tissue paper to get rid of most of the water, and then lift a little bit of paint because I want that highlight to be nice and bright. Let's move on to the next purple petal. Skip this large one in the center so that we don't get into the areas that we just painted, and work on this one. So I'm gonna do a very light coverage of purple with some magenta on the edges. This particular edge here to me looks like there is a vein, and veins on these purple petals are pink, so I'm gonna do bright pink. Then there's a bit of a fold with a shadow, and I'm going to add pure blue, my phthalo blue, more purple under this petal. So I'm just marking up future shadow areas at this point. I'm gonna try to do a vein with my magenta and move on to the next one, the large petal in the center. So I must admit I'm most nervous about this one because it has quite a variation of colors, from pink on top and in the center to purple at the bottom. It also has a bunch of veins, folds, and highlights. So what I'm gonna do is first mark up the pink areas in the center and up on top, then blend with clear water so that I can move all the way down and use my violet and purple classic wet into wet, where every stroke you put down blends with other colors that you've put down already, but there's still some opportunity to create some definition if you're using more saturated strokes. And let's not forget the back of the petal, the little folded part, and the red part that's visible in the center where I'm going to use magenta. Enough time has passed, and this is what my paper looks like. So still wet but not dripping with water. So let's try the veins with more saturated magenta. Don't worry if you're not too comfortable with this wet on wet technique. For more fine details, you can always paint it on top when your paper is dry, but try it out, play around with it. Here I'm going to use coral, try to do a longer vein, and I think this time around I really did get the timing right for the wet on wet. It's always tricky to time it perfectly, but this is exactly how wet you want it to look if you want to do small details. This is often necessary for botanicals, like if you have pansies, for example. I have a whole class on pansies where there are a lot of colorful veins, and even though we can do them wet on dry, they will look sharp. If you want them to look more natural, then you have to time your drawing time and try to get it in, try to paint those veins right before your paper is dry to get that soft blended look. We can finish it off by maybe lifting a little bit of paint to further define the highlights. So here I go with one. You can see I switched to a different brush. These flat brushes are very convenient for lifting tiny thin lines, so I'm using this synthetic. Actually, synthetics work much better because they're more stiff, and I just dry them on tissue paper so they're still a little bit damp, and then lift the veins that I want to lift. This to me always feels a little bit like sculpting rather than painting. I'm chipping away at painted areas and creating a sense of form on paper by creating these highlights. We can do the same thing up on top here. Make some thin highlights just with the edge of your flat brush. And let's leave it. Move on to the top. We have just one more part that needs some red, and I'm gonna go with coral, trying to leave a bunch of highlights blank, so working slowly with the tip of my brush. And then on the right hand side, I'm going to switch to quinacridone red, so use your cooler red, and again leave some highlights. You can use a damp brush if you tap it on tissue paper to get rid of excess water to kind of soften the edges around your highlights. Here you can use any warm green that you have on hand, or you can use a variety of warm greens. You can always add a little bit of yellow to your green. Paint it in sections. See, the way I'm doing it is I'm painting just one section at a time, leaving some highlights. The key will be to add a little bit of your shadow red to arrive at a good definition. And of course, those white highlights are helping us quite a bit by creating an illusion of form. Reds mixed with greens always give you sort of a nice natural looking brown, and you can finish up on top with a sharp edge. And let's leave it for now. The last thing we have for this layer is those beautiful elongated stamens. Absolutely adore this flower. It's such a beautiful, intricate shape. So what I would do is just go with whatever color you used on the petals. So I have my quinacridone coral and quinacridone red. You can use one at a time or both. These are very fine details. So if you can, if your brush size allows it, add some color variation wet on wet by dropping a little bit of more saturated paint once you cover each stamen. Here I'm gonna add a little bit more saturated coral on the tip and on the stem, but if your drawing is too small, I wouldn't worry too much about it and just do solid coverage of light red on each stamen, leaving the tips blank for now. We're gonna work on the second layer of color, defining the shadows and areas of light. By the end of the step, our flower will look much more realistic and will have a really good sense of volume. All the main shadows will be defined, and at this stage you want to make your color mixtures just a little bit more saturated than what you used in the first layer, but don't go fully saturated. So make sure your mixture is still quite watery, maybe a step or two darker than where you started with. So I'm gonna start with the purple petals, and for the most part, I'm gonna work with dioxazine purple, maybe adding a little bit of magenta. I'm focusing on the main areas of shadow. So in the third layer, we will be adding a little bit more depth and even more dark colors, but for now, it's just larger areas of shadow that we're working on, and by painting them, we're defining our areas of light. This entire exercise is about creating volume, a sense of 3D volume on paper. So our first layer was more of a color map with some very basic suggestion of light and color areas. Here we can really go a few steps darker, not fully saturated, but a little bit darker, and start working on those shadows. And so you can see I'm slowly moving along. You can see the back of this petal, and there's another very strong shadow. You can blend these shadows into our original color, either by blending them with clear water or by adding these tiny strokes that connect different areas of shadow. So here I've painted the shadow with my dioxazine purple, added a little bit of magenta and a little bit of darker purple into that wet area, added a little bit of texture with tiny strokes up on top, and now I'm gonna leave it to dry. We will come back to add some more definition. For now, the main shadows are done and the main areas of light are suddenly popping and are much more accentuated compared to where we started. And now this part over here, very dark shadow. We've already identified it in the first layer by using lots of purple. But as you can see, especially now that it dried out, it's quite a bit lighter compared to where we started. So let's paint the darkest part with a little bit of purple, then blend with clear water. This shadow over here, one of the largest well-defined shadows, the large petal in the center is casting it all over that petal on the right. I'm gonna use some dioxazine purple mixed with maybe a little bit of magenta, and then wet into wet, I'm gonna add more magenta into it. Again, not fully saturated. You can sort of see the veins that we painted in the first layer, but already quite a bit darker than everything around it. And you can see how by painting the shadow, we're able to accentuate light on the petal that's up on top. And now the area on the right, there we see just a little bit of the inside of the petal, and pure purple, or if you're using a mixture of magenta and blue, 50-50 will do. Just enough to differentiate the inside and the outside. And to add a little bit of a variation in value, I'm gonna drop more saturated purple on top and at the bottom. Carry that shadow over because we have a large red petal up on top. So just a thin strip of color and then blend with clear water. I want this shadow on the right to be very sharp. And so I continue dropping more and more color as I go along the edge, switching from magenta to purple. And let's move on to the right and reinforce the shadow. Maybe I'm gonna use quinacridone red, just make it darker. I think it deserves a little bit more depth. Let's double down on that and move on to our largest purple petal. This one, again, we're gonna work around the edges, focusing on the shadows. So I'm gonna go with my purple, and I still have a little bit, just a tiny bit of magenta there. And I'm gonna try to reinforce the veins that we created using the lifting technique in the first layer. If you skip that lifting part, totally fine, because you can use negative painting technique to create these veins. And so just a quick reminder, negative painting is painting around an object rather than painting on the object. So we're painting around the vein here, reinforcing it. If you already had a very light vein that you created by lifting paint, or you can just create it right now with me by painting around them with a darker color. And see how we're shaping the petal by adding our purple and blue all around the edges, and towards the center there's almost no color. So we just have that first underlying layer of very light purple. We're done for now with this petal. Let's work on our top set of petals, work with our reds, and similarly we're gonna just focus on the large shadows, avoiding the highlights, avoiding the areas that receive the most light. And I'm gonna start at the base with the darkest shadow that I started with Bordeaux to introduce a little bit of cooler color, and I've added a little bit of permanent alizarin crimson. You can also just use your Perylene violet as we discussed. And I see a very strong shadow in the center. The petal sort of has two halves, right? And so each half has a bit of a bump that receives a fair amount of light. In the middle, we have that kind of folded area facing away from the light, so I'm reinforcing it. And the right half that has some texture as well also has a few shadows, and I've marked them up first with my cooler Bordeaux, my shadow color, and then just judging by how saturated that area is, I'm gonna reinforce it with my coral, blend with a damp brush, and now we have that kind of bump that's getting a lot of light on the left hand side. I'm gonna use coral and again focus just on those areas that are in the shadow, notice that there are a few sections, and we already started identifying them in the first layer by leaving some highlights. Now let's just continue up on top of what we've already painted, just reinforcing the shadows, and by doing this we're accentuating the highlights. And I just dropped my brush. Very strong, kind of elongated shadows going along the center vein of that petal. So I used a lot of Bordeaux there along the edge. Again, a little bit of Bordeaux. Connect it to the tip. Blend with the damp brush. And maybe finish off just with our base red, quinacridone red. Right now, I don't want to overwork my paper. Let's move on to the next petal, starting with Bordeaux, then clear water to blend. And now on this side that's closer to us and a little bit more faced towards the light, I'm going to just use quinacridone red and again blend with clear water. Some coral on this side and blend with clear water to finish it off. Let's add some shadow red at the bottom. So I use Bordeaux. Another thing I'm going to do is grab my opera pink, which as you know is a fugitive color, but I like adding these fluorescent splashes, even though we know after a few years it will likely fade a bit, but it's just such a lovely, vibrant pigment that is of course completely optional here, but if you have it, do apply it to the veins just a little bit. It's granulating, so you don't need to use too much water, just a few strokes and your veins will stand out. So let's talk about the stamens. We have a bit of a challenge here because we're painting on white background, but the tips of the stamens are white. Our reference photo has that deep dark background, and so the tips stand out. So what we need to do is apply the principles that we discussed when we painted the white rose. And you may remember that when painting white subjects on white paper, we need to focus on the shadows. So I'm going to use my shadow red, Perylene Violet in this case. I want it to be a little bit more brown, and you can use any of your shadow reds to create these shadows and outlines, but I'm not going to use fully saturated Perylene Violet, just maybe a little bit of pigment in the water mixture. And I'm also going to try and reinforce the shadows on some of the stamens using coral. So we have a nice contrast between the elongated stamen and the tip that's technically white but has some shadows. That's it for our second layer. I feel like there's still a little bit of room for us to accentuate the shadows, and so this is why I call this third layer an accent layer, because essentially what we're going to do is just go over the darkest shadows and try to find areas that are super dark, so fully saturated. In other words, they would look black almost if you were to switch to black and white view, and add a little bit of color in those areas. Let's move on to this petal over here. Just a very saturated Daxazine purple over the area that we've already identified as a shadow. Maybe add a little bit of magenta, working very slowly with the tip of my brush. And I'm focusing for the most part on those deep shadows on the right hand side and up on top. I will also add a few strokes at the very bottom around the edge, again using the interrupted stroke technique. Just tiny little spots of purple. At this stage, I'm not worried about skipping the petals because we're working on such small areas of color. So I'm just going from petal to petal. Even the ones that are overlapping, I'm not worried about my colors blending. My mixture is, for the most part, saturated, but I'm not loading the brush fully. I'm working on tiny spots, and so they dry out very quickly. I'm gonna get in the very middle here in between the petals, and I'm gonna use my violet, or you can add magenta to your purple. Just double down on those shadows and maybe add just a tiny bit on the right hand side for our central petal. And now I'm gonna move to the right, and this sharp shadow is quite dark, but we can still see just a tiny bit of veins. That means that our layers are still transparent even after several glazes. So I'm gonna add a sharp line featuring dioxazine purple, blend with clear water, and suddenly you can see how the central petal pops. At the very bottom right there, now I need to balance it out, make it a lot darker. So my only option, sort of last resort, is to use pure blue, which would appear to be further away compared to purple. And so I'm gonna add that. And then we have that area along the edge that used to be dark, but now in comparison to the dark shadows we just painted, it needs a little bit more saturated values. So I'm gonna go in and add that. Maybe instead of blending with clear water, I'm gonna use a little bit of interrupted stroke. That's it for our purple petals. Let's take a look at the red section and see where we can add some accents, some deep shadows. And I'm gonna start on the right with that deep shadow in the center, and I'm gonna use Perylene Violet. Paint with almost fully saturated violet and then blend with clear water. Let's move down, again using Perylene Violet, or you can use your permanent alizarin crimson. I feel like violet is a little bit more intense, and just glaze very slowly over the darkest areas, blending with clear water. Here is the shadow that I promised we would definitely go back to. It's very pronounced in the reference photo. The light is sort of coming from the top right, so we have that dark area on the left, and I'm gonna add a little bit of Perylene Violet, then blend with clear water, and then move up just like we did in the second layer, only focusing on those dark areas all the way to the tip. And again, just like we did in the second layer, add a little bit of saturated coral up on top. This might be already at the stage where your colors are fully saturated, so if it's looking opaque, you don't need to add any more. These are finishing touches that are usually very specific to how you've approached the first two layers, and if the first two layers had enough contrast and saturation, you don't need to follow with this third layer. All we have left to do is maybe just a few accents all the way down on our stamens. I'm simply going to take a look at the balance of values, mostly around the tips, and if there's some overlapping elements or elements that perhaps can use a little bit of definition, I'm gonna add those. So using coral, I'm gonna work with the tip of my brush, adding just a little bit of shadow on some of the stamens to define them just a little bit further. And quick trick, blending the edge between the stamens and the shadow on the purple petal. I'm gonna connect them so that they don't look like they're completely separate and just floating up in the air. So most of my shadows will be concentrated up on top of the stamen lines and blend right into that purple petal. It was probably one of my favorite flowers to paint this year. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I will see you very soon with something a little bit larger and more complex, featuring a bird. Thank you for watching and painting with me.